Max Chandler-Mather, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the stalemate over the government's Housing Australia Future Fund, the $10 billion fund. They want to put in place an income stream to pay for public and affordable housing. You've been refusing to back it so far. What's the compromise you're putting forward today?
Well, the Greens have shifted and now we'd like Labor too, and we've said two things. One, we'd like a guarantee of $2.5 billion of investment in public, community and affordable housing every year. And we want the federal government to coordinate a national freeze on rent increases by putting $1 billion on the table, similar to the way they've coordinated other national reform efforts to states and territories who freeze rent increases for 2 years and introduce caps on rents after that.
So let's just pick up on that last part, the freeze on rents and capping rents after that. As you point out, the states would have to agree to this. I don't think they have so far. But look, if the Commonwealth could convince them with an extra $1 billion, as you say, what impact is that going to have on supply? We just heard the Reserve Bank Governor there say these sort of price controls distort supply. Would this hurt supply?
So the useful thing about a rent freeze is other countries have used it around the world as well as rent caps, and so we have a lot of evidence around that. New Jersey was a state that introduced rent caps, and the research found there was no material impact on the supply of private housing. What we did see, though, was an impact on reducing rents. And the reason we're proposing this is because there are now millions of renters who are falling into renter stress. And that means that a lot of them are one rent increase away from eviction onto the streets. And so there's two ways to solve the housing crisis. We need public housing, but we need the queues for social and affordable housing to reduce as well. Every person evicted out of a private home is another person who joins the 10-year-long wait list for social housing.
Just coming back to this point, though, I'm not sure about the New Jersey example, but clearly the Reserve Bank and others do have concerns about what this would mean. Is there any work you've done, the Parliamentary Budget Office, anyone else, to look at ongoing controls on rents, what that would mean for housing supply?
We've looked at a wealth of evidence, and the other thing to point out is that Australia, ACT, currently has caps on rent increases at just over inflation. A bunch of states and territories...
just over inflation, you said?
Just over inflation.
So they can increase rents by over the
inflation
7%.
Plus 10% of inflation, so it's like 7.1%.
Assuming you'd want something more strict than that.
Well, that's right. But the other thing that happened during the pandemic was that states and territories across the country introduced a freeze on rent increases. And so we have seen it used in the country before.
During a crisis.
That's right. Well, this is a crisis, David. And actually the housing crisis is a lot worse than it was during the pandemic.
That was a temporary measure. You're talking about ongoing caps. What would you say to mum and dad investors who've done nothing wrong, followed the rules? You know, they might not be on a big income, but this is their nest egg. They're copping these soaring interest rates at the moment, and suddenly they're told there's an ongoing cap on what you can charge for rent. What do you say to them?
Well, firstly, with negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, they can write rental losses off.
You want to get rid of those too?
Only for people with more than one investment property. The second thing to say is that really the bottom line here is that there are 1/3 of the country rents. 1/3 of the country rents. It is not sustainable to have a housing system where at the end of every lease, a person's rent can go up by as much as the landlord or real estate agent wants. This is destroying people's lives, and it's having a broader impact on the economy. We know that the workplaces are finding massive shortages of workers because the teachers, nurses, cleaners, aged care workers can't afford the rent in the places where they need to work. That's not a sustainable system. And what we've said to the government is that around the world, rent caps have worked, rent freezes have worked, and there's no reason why you shouldn't do it here.
There's a lot of countries that don't do rent freezes or rent caps. You've cited New Jersey. But just coming back to that question, why haven't you done any study here about the impact in the Australian market? We
have. So we've looked at impacts that rent freezes and rent caps have had on Australia before.
So who's done that work?
Well, we have, and a lot of academics and economists. Who do you mean by we?
Is that...
Well, we've relied on...
Your office or...?
Sure, but we've relied on our economic analysis by economists and housing experts.
And will you release that so we can have a look at it and see what you're talking about?
Well, it's publicly available evidence, so...
On the website or...?
Yes, sure, we can put it on the website. I can point to all of that research. I mean, what it has showed, by the way, is that rents declined, rental stress declined, and it had no material impact on housing supply. With regards to supply, the key issue here at the moment is that Australia is no longer building public and affordable housing the way it used to. And the other key part of our demand to the government is that if we just rely on property developers, then we're going to get what we've got over the last 20 years, which is soaring house prices and less people being able to afford to buy a house. So
let's come to that other part of your offer today. You want the government, currently their plan with the housing fund is to spend up to $500 million a year. You're saying spend at least $2.5 billion a year. And this is a $10 billion fund, so that would run out pretty quickly, wouldn't it?
Well, no, our proposal is you would just take that out of the budget. So one of our key issues with Labor's plan as it stands is this is a $10 billion gamble on the stock market with no guarantee that it will produce any amount of money. Last year, the Future Fund, the body they want to invest the money through, lost 1.2%. It would have lost money.
What about the year before?
Sure, it made money then, but
it made 22% return.
And then during the GFC, it lost 4.5%.
But its 10-year average is?
Yes, but
growth of nearly 10%.
Sure, but we're talking about year-on-year spends. So why would you set up a housing funding system where it loses money when the economy is going down, precisely the moments when we want to invest in public and affordable housing? So during the GFC...
If your argument about this is a gamble on the stock market,
yes,
you'd shut down the whole Future Fund if that's your view, wouldn't you?
Well, no, but what we're talking about is you don't fund schools and hospitals via investments on the stock market that don't make a return in some years.
But this is in addition to what they're investing in public and social housing.
Which is virtually nothing.
Sure, you make that point, but
yes,
it's not like there's nothing else. This is a new fund on top of what's already being spent.
So Australia is spending less on public housing than it ever has in the history of this country. So to give you an example, if we were building the same amount of public housing as we were in the 20th century over the next 5 years, Australia would build 150,000 public and affordable homes. Right now, dwelling approvals for public sector housing is at the lowest it's ever been in this country's history. So no, we don't think what the government's doing right now is good or in any way going to take the housing crisis seriously.
So bottom line, are you really going to, if they don't give you what you've asked for today, are you really going to join Peter Dutton and block this new fund that's designed to build more housing?
Well, A, it's not clear it's going to build more housing. B, of course we go into a negotiation with the possibility that we might vote it down. It's not much of a negotiation. But our point to the government is this is one of the worst housing crises in this country's history. If they can find $30 billion a year for the stage 3 tax cuts that see every politician get $9,000 a year, why can't they find $2.5 billion for public and affordable housing and $1 billion for a freeze on rent increases? How do you explain that?
Bottom line, isn't something better than nothing? I mean, voting for this is going to deliver something.
I don't think I could look the people in the eye that I've spoken to over the last few months, the people one rent increase away from eviction, the people who are on a 10-year wait list for social housing and know that under the government's plan, the wait list for social housing will get bigger. And the shortage right now, by the way, is 640,000 social and affordable homes. And that is going to increase by 75,000 homes. And the government has said they can build up to 30,000 homes over the next 5 years. So really what they're saying is the crisis is going to get worse under their plan. That is not a response to the housing crisis.
But can you look those same people in the eye and say, I voted against up to 30,000 homes?
Well, it's not clear that it is 30,000 homes. That's our point, what we're saying to the government. And I think really there needs to be a question for the government here. Last year, they recalled parliaments around the country to put caps on energy prices. You see the Treasurer get up and say, well, you know, we've put limits on energy prices. But all of a sudden, rents don't matter. You know, why is it that 1/3 of this country don't get the sort of political representation, renters, where a lot of other people in the country do, especially when what we're proposing has been used in Australia before, freezes on rent increases, used around the world. Spain, for instance, just introduced caps on rent increases because they're looking after renters, unlike the government right now.
Just one other element of what you put forward today, you're also suggesting the government should buy existing homes in the market rather than just building new ones. Just explain to me how that would work. Would there be a Commonwealth bidder alongside other bidders at an auction? Well,
the government could use the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, and they could blind bid, so the person selling the home wouldn't necessarily know that the government is buying it. But
so it's a secret government agent, basically.
Well, actually, the most focus we're on is that right now, over the next 5 years, the National Rental Affordability Scheme rentals, 24,000 of them, the federal government is continuing with the coalition policy of withdrawing funding for those. So what that means, and this is our other big concern, is the country's about to lose funding for 24,000 affordable rentals because the federal government are not continuing funding for them. So we've said to the government now, hey, let's try and work out a plan where we buy a portion of those and introduce an emergency increase in funding for those to make sure that we don't lose 24,000 affordable rentals at the same time as we're in the worst housing crisis we've seen in generations.
I want to ask you about this point that Philip Lowe, the Reserve Bank Governor, made during the week about the number of people per dwelling. I'll just bring up this graph here. It really illustrates the last 20 years, this fall in the number of people per dwelling, and at the end there, particularly coming out of the COVID lockdowns, more people moving out, they want a home office, they want a bit more space. So you're now below 2.5 people on average per household. If more people want their own place, that does increase demand further, doesn't it?
So I've had a look at that data, and underlying that is the reduction in the number of children per household. So the number of adults hasn't dropped that much, but what we are seeing is a shift in the nuclear family. So Philip Lowe is sort of wrong to suggest that somehow we need more share houses. Everyone who can is living in a share house already because rents are sky high. Really, the way to solve this issue, A, is a large-scale investment in public and affordable housing, the way the country used to in the 20th century, and a freeze on rent increases, because the other problem we're having right now is that you're having people evicted out of long-term places, which means they're going to then go and join the queues for finding a new rental. We just need some stability to this system, which, again, and I really need to emphasise this, the government did with the energy system. And our point again and again is if you can cap energy prices and coordinate that with the states, literally recall parliaments around the country in the lead up to Christmas, why can't you do that for rents?
Yeah, I suppose it's the fact that you've got so many landlords out there who would be affected by this rather than so few energy companies. But let me ask you about supply, because Philip Lowe kept making that point. We've got to boost supply. Everywhere you look, the problem is supply. You've been accused in your own seat of not supporting more housing supply. There's a big housing development on the Brisbane riverbank that has more than 850 new dwellings that you opposed. Another development on an old industrial site with 2 residential towers that you opposed. I mean, what do you say to this? Is it a case that more housing supply needs to go in someone else's backyard?
No, so the development you're referring to is proposed to be built in a giant floodplain. And our point was that...
Well, the council assessment found there was no additional flood risk, to be clear.
Well, no, they relied on developer paid for flood modelling, but if you...
Well, they followed the assessment process that council always follows.
Yeah, and in the past, and I know what that leads to, because during the floods, I was in people's basements where a developer had been approved to build a development tower, and they had lost power and lost everything they owned.
Okay, what about the other side, the one that's not on a floodplain? You opposed that as well. You want more parkland. Is there any dwelling, medium or high density dwelling in your seat you're willing to support?
Well, what we've proposed is that a proportion of those developments be provided as public and affordable housing. And this speaks to a broader problem. The argument is that somehow NIMBYs or a hold-up in the planning system is what's causing the housing crisis. There is no evidence of that. So over the last 8 years,
Really? No evidence?
No. So 94% of planning approvals, so planning applications in Sydney and Melbourne were approved, and 100,000 of those approved dwellings in Sydney were not built because developers will only ever build properties where they make a profit. Our point to the government is when you have land in the city, it should be held over for public and affordable housing, because what you get instead is either a developer building high-end apartments no one can afford, or land banking it and only building it when house prices are increasing again.
They can only build them if they get an approval.
Yes.
So again, is there anywhere, I mean, you live in an inner city electorate, that this is the very place where people need to live closer to where they work and so on. Is there anywhere in your electorate you'd support more medium density housing?
Yeah, heaps. So I wrote to the Queensland Planning Minister and proposed, I think, up to 15 locations across my electorate, including on one of those sites you mentioned. There's a portion of that site that isn't at a flood risk, and we've said that should be bought by the federal government to be provided as public and affordable housing. I also have identified a lot of vacant lots, old rundown apartments that are no longer in use, that could be renovated and used for public and affordable housing. It's up to 15 locations. And again, the federal government should be engaged in this planning process, because what we've seen over the last 20 years is what developers want, which is unlimited power to do whatever they want, to be basically the only people building housing in this country. Now the federal government has abandoned their responsibility to provide housing, and we've got the housing crisis we have right now. All we're saying is let's start building public and affordable housing and controlling rents in the way countries around the world have done and Australia has done before.
Max Chandler-Mather, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks.